I just want to correct some things. I am a social worker and a clinical psychologist. Most of my current teaching is on mental health in a master degree online on mental health recovery and social inclusion. My title at the University of Hertfordshire is Professor of Social Inclusion and Well-Being. As you will see, those of you who will be here on Thursday, I will also talk about a current collaborative study on social work with asylum seekers in North Greece and South Italy, which for me is part of social work, but also part of deinstitutionalization in many ways. I'm very sorry not to be in Dubrovnik. I like being in Dubrovnik, and I like being in the company of the people who come to these conferences. So I'm sorry to be missing it. Okay, slide number 1, please. Next slide. Yeah, okay. Digitalisation is the policy and practice which responds to the existence of total institutions, which have been the main response of European countries, as well as all English-speaking countries since the 18th century, in which people experiencing mental ill health or intellectual difficulties were segregated from the rest of society. Michel Foucault described the creation of those institutions in his book, Madness and Civilization. Anyone who has not read it, I recommend reading it. It's good history for a change. And Erving Goffman from the United States, described in very clear, stark terms, the totality of this process and the stigma. The underlying idea, the justification for the creation of institution, was that it would be therapeutic for people with either mental illness or learning disability to be segregated from the rest of us in order to be given the best treatment in an environment dedicated to their needs. And it was clearly also further created for the sake of those without any diagnosis, to protect them from the assumed risk institutionalized people bring with them. Next slide, please. I think the totality needs to be understood, partly because it is disappearing. The totality meant total physical, psychological, and social segregation from family member, anybody else, for the rest of the inmate lives. And in the heydays, this institution had huge farms, and most of the physical needs of the inmates were met by their own unpaid work. This is an element that usually is not mentioned at all, that they were working there. I visited a place in Australia which was a total institution and became a university. And to my amazement, it had a huge cricket pitch where people played cricket. The people who played cricket were not the patient or the inmate, they were the staff, but it was huge. So it was a completely separated world. It has led to increasing stigma, deprivation, segregation, all of which are sufficient to drive an inmate to despair and to prevent any positive personal development. In 1915, there was an interesting incident. 2 ladies who were in the Littlemore Hospital near Oxford, a total institution, absconded. They simply left and nobody noticed it. And they came back after 2 weeks of their own will because they couldn't find a place for themselves outside the hospital. The world has moved and they didn't recognize that world and they had nobody to turn to. So this was really a total segregation. Also, we need to remember that for a very long time, people with either mental illness and or mental difficulties were hospitalized together in these institutions. So they were never just about mental illness or just about intellectual difficulties. They were a mixed bag of different diagnoses. Next. Yeah. And the outcomes were the loss of self-esteem, the loss of esteem of others, loss of any ordinary life. I think it's difficult for us even to understand it or face it. There was fear of the outside and fear of those outside of the people who were inside. The treatment that were given at the beginning were really cruel. There's no other way to treat it. Cruel interventions like lobotomy, like cold baths, moving people from one temperature to another extreme temperature in order to change something, which I think was actually an indication of not knowing what to do. And lobotomy meant people lost quite a lot of their brain capacity. Yeah. Of course, there was also repression of any intimate relationship, but this actually led to forced sexual relationship by both staff and patient towards other patients. So these were very repressive places. The most basic freedoms, like to choose what to eat for breakfast, where to eat it, when to eat it, with whom to eat it, all of that was not on, because everything was dictated to people. And also people were infantilized by this way of treatment. And women were sterilized in the UK until 1975. It's quite important to remember that, because the belief was that if they will give birth to those children, the children will suffer automatically from mental illness. And of course, the institution were a center of power for certain professions, not for all of them, but especially for doctors, either psychiatrists or doctors specializing in intellectual difficulties. Next slide, please. So when it was, okay, I will go in a minute to when the process of digitalization started and why, but just to remind you, according to CISAC and Biddle-Brown, from a study of 27 countries of the EU on digitalization in 2020, mentioned that deinstitutionalized services should have a high level of participation in community life, being accepted by the community, choice, quality of support, dignity, and respect. We need to judge what happened instead, whether it meets with those expectations. And interestingly, CISAC and Biddle-Brown, although writing in 2020, don't mention at all the contribution of the recovery approach or the strengths approach, which certainly has made a huge difference to the life of those who were deinstitutionalized, either because of mental illness or because of intellectual difficulties. And just to remind you, the recovery approach is about the ability to lead a meaningful life with and without the disability, whatever the disability is. And the strengths approach, which was developed in social work in the early 90s, in all areas of social work, is about recognizing the potential strengths of people and how to help them to develop them into real everyday potentials. Quite often, other helping professions do not recognize the contribution of social work, but the strengths approach has been well documented, and it's difficult to deny that contribution. Next slide, please. When this relation started, it actually started by some change inside the total institution. The first place was during the Second World War in the UK in the form of therapeutic communities. That meant staying in the hospital, but changing the regime into one in which the resident had a say in how it was run. They had a say in what was happening to them, in decisions about themselves, and they could take more responsibility for their own life. They were also involved in running the place in terms of day-to-day activities. It's of course not accidental that this started first with soldiers who suffered from shell shock, which is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, in the First World War. Let me remind you that from the First World War and to the Second, countries like the UK would court anyone who left the army because of the post-traumatic stress disorder. They were court-martialed and they were shot by the army. And this type of, well, brutality, atrocity, there's no other way to call it, continued to the Second World War. They stopped it in the Second World War. So the war actually had a considerable impact on humanizing the system for people who were in institutions, as well as for the soldiers. The soldiers were always, and you can see that in other countries as well, when there is a political conflict or a war, the soldiers are getting the best treatment because there is a sense of owning them because of the sacrifice they make for a particular country. Now, this was the beginning of social psychiatry. There's a very interesting book by David Clarke, who was the director of Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridge, where one of the first therapeutic communities was established in the early 1960s, just a little bit after the war. Next slide, please. They were changing perspective not only in terms of the institutions, and then or the way we think about the institution, and that is important to understand. Goffman, who wrote so much about the stigma and explained the nature of the totality of those institutions, was very influenced by the Chicago School symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism, which relates to the work of Herbert Mead, is about recognizing that our existence is also partly about, if you want, the symbolism, the images, the ideological and life and ideas that we have. And that the meaning of existing is not just about the conditions of existence, but the value that society and the person gives to their living conditions. So what helped to open the institution were those precedences in the therapeutic community, the end of the Second World War, the experience that also led to the establishment of the welfare state in the countries that instituted it. So this was a period of huge social change. It started by enabling family members to visit, by enriching the variety of activities in hospital, and medics would say because of new medication. The new medication was antipsychotic, while the old medication that was still in use was electroshock, ECT, and also insulin injections. I'm not going to go into great details about the medication, but to say that quite a number of the changes actually happened before the medication was introduced. So it's a moot area whether it was because of medication. Some people would like to think so. My view is that it's because of the social changes that most societies had after the end of the Second World War. And of course, we are talking really about Europe and in English-speaking countries which were not based in Europe. Much less was happening in the Third World, and we need to remember that. Housing was a very important issue because without the element of housing, digitalization was not possible. And housing is also where some of the key problems that I will mention in a minute also took place. And there were quite a lot of experiments, especially in the United States, in looking at comparing institutions that have gone for digitalization regime, preparing people to move outside and following them outside, doing it retrospectively 35 years backward, compared with those institutions that didn't go at the same time for their digitalization. And this showed that those who were living outside were achieving a lot more and had a much better quality of life as well, and didn't need to return to a psychiatric hospital most of the time and for most of them. Next slide, please. Okay, before I go to the Italian reform, this of course was related also to the creation of community services, without which it would be impossible to do any digitalization. I was personally involved in one place in London. It was a huge hospital with 3,000 beds created in the late 19th century. And I remember that none of the patients who were there believed that the hospital was really going to close, because they continued to maintain the hospital, like they would repaint wards that were in a very poor condition. So people concluded that the talk about leaving the hospital was not serious. They changed their mind afterwards, and I will explain that in a minute, what was the process. But the two main ways of deinstitutionalizing was the Italian Psychiatria Democratica versus the United States style of deinstitutionalization. And the UK style was a bit different. And this is partly because countries that have a national health service usually do better than those with an insurance-funded health service in terms of ensuring basic continuous access to health and social care. This has been proven in the case of mental illness by Wilkinson and Piquet. Anyone who didn't read the book, The Spirit, I will just, sorry, just a sec. The spirit level, I'm not sure you can see it, but maybe some of you. The spirit level shows that, and they included also countries like Japan, China, as well as Europe and English-speaking countries outside of Europe. And there is a correlation between having a national health service and a national social security system or not, in terms of whether the institution could succeed. So to come to the Italian psychiatric reform, which I know has also impacted on what was happening in Slovenia afterwards, this was taking place. The Italian law about the reform came into place in 1978, much earlier than it came, that this legislation came to any English-speaking country. And of course, much earlier than it came to Central and East Europe, as you well know. So we need to remember that we may not agree with either the Italian way or the United States way, but there were in each country, there were good and poor deinstitutionalization programs. And I suggest that the quality of the process depended partly on the people leading a program, partly on the health funding system, which I've mentioned already. And in turn, it really depends on the belief system of mental health staff, as well as that of the politicians. The two social groups that are key to digitalization are mental health staff and politicians. Unfortunately, it's not service users, or it has not been service users Maybe it's more now. Next slide, please. And the Italian psychiatric reform was very clearly simply saying institutions are bad for all of us. And so the title of Basalia's publication in 1968, L'Istituzione Negata, the negated institution, is really encapsulating this idea that it was both unnecessary and unjustified social exclusion of people with either of the two disabilities we are talking about. And by the way, by now there is a discussion whether mental illness is a disability or maybe it is just a response to stress. And it was aimed at democratizing the system, treating residents as citizens. And that is a huge difference from treating them as patients. And you could see it in many, many ways. I've got here one of the classical publications by the Italians. They invited a writer who was in residence in Turin. She was in one of their big psychiatric hospitals for a year. And she published a book with the ironic title, 10,000 linen later, i.e. the number of bed changes that she witnessed. And this is basically a narrative of what was happening. Likewise, anyone who has seen any of the videos that Psychiatria Democratica was quite good at developing some of them, could see how there were day-long discussions between patient or residents and the staff, how to do it, how to go about opening it. And there was quite an involvement of the community, of the local community, bringing in, for example, writers, artists to work with the people who were inside before they left the institution. And all of the hospitals that were closed, and they were literally closed, the area was used, the buildings were used for other purposes, which are community purposes like universities, cooperative sites, and community projects. Unlike in English-speaking countries, where quite a lot of the buildings were sold to private companies that developed housing with some agreements that some of the housing would go for people who left the hospital. So very different approach to how to work with the community. And Psychiatria Democratica invested a lot more in going to the community, in trying to get people to engage in a dialogue on what it's like to be in a hospital and why people need to go. I remember I was once in Bari in south of Italy, and what they did is they went to the community, just to the street, and invited people to use their straitjacket. I don't know if you remember straitjacket, which means that people's hands are put together at their back, and you can do very little when this happens to you. And they literally encourage people to try it out and to tell each other what did it feel like. In Trieste, for example, they made a horse from paper and mashed paper, and called it a Trojan horse, and went with it to shops and talked to everybody. So a lot, and there was also an exhibition of photographs. Basalia literally invited some of the most famous photographers of the day, not just from Europe, from the United States as well. And there was a huge exhibition that moved from one place to another. So the Italian effort, when people left, they left for small group homes, but they also usually were put into a work cooperative where they worked part-time. And the cooperatives enabled everyone to be a member with stakes. You paid a symbolic sum to get the right to be involved in all of the decisions. And that, again, that made a huge difference. One other element of the Italian reform that did not exist in English-speaking countries was a project in which ordinary people from the community without any known disability participated alongside people with either mental illness or learning disabilities. In Trieste, for example, there was a huge project called Luna e l'altra, one in the feminine conjugation and the other, which is also, Luna is the moon and its reflection, if you want, where women from the community and women who left the hospital were doing things together. They made a decision what to do together. And it ranged from cosmetic treatment to political demonstrations. So a completely different approach to involving the community and to really treating people as full citizens. Also, the relationship between providers and service users were changed, like there were no separate dining facilities, which you can still see in UK general hospitals, that the staff has separate dining areas from any patient. Use of first names and giving wine with medication. When I did show to colleagues in the UK the video in which they give wine with medication in some Italian services, they were totally shocked, because this was supposed to be really like giving poison to patients. And there was no element of recognition that most Italians drink wine with their meals normally. So why not with medication? Makes it a bit sweeter. Next slide, please. The English country's approach was much more individualized. It was about preparing people to move to live in the community, finding a place for them to live in the community, again in small group homes usually, and not developing community mental health services, but not excluding hospitalization. So hospital became much smaller rather than were closed. They were closed eventually, quite a number of them, over a period of some 20 years. But the idea was to do it slowly. So the move to housing solution was crucial, but not necessarily to permanent one. I'm sure that our colleague from the United States, who is going to talk this afternoon, will mention it, that in the US, for example, people were moved from hospital to housing, to sheltered housing, and the rent was paid by the Social Security system. But when those areas were gentrified, the rent went high, became much higher, and it was not covered. That change was not covered by the Social Security. So people became homeless. And the whole deinstitutionalization movement was described as leading to homelessness. This did not actually happen, as I said, in countries where there was a national health and social care services. And I remember there was Professor Kathleen Jones, who was professor of social policy in York University in the UK, went to visit Italy with an Italian journalist. And they were trying to say that many Italian ex-patients became homeless. It was very difficult to see it. I've been to Rome more than once and could see, what was happening in a city like Rome, and there were very few homeless people. In English-speaking countries also, initially, anyone who left was supposed to move to a daycare, because there was a fear of what will happen to people if they will be without a framework that would contain them. It was a bit ridiculous because we had a lot of older people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who were moved, and it was ridiculous to put them for the whole day in daycare. Very few people needed to come back to hospital even for a much shorter period. The alternatives that were established both in Italy and in English-speaking countries were psychiatric wards in general hospitals, much smaller in terms of the ratio of the population to beds. But in some places like Trieste, there were beds in community centers. And that meant that even people who needed to be hospitalized were together with other people, and they used to go every lunchtime to the local trattoria. I remember people who were physically held on both sides, who went from their center to the trattoria. And the trattoria was an ordinary trattoria, but there was a booking for certain places for people coming from the center. So having beds in the community center changed the whole focus, and quite often the general hospital psychiatric ward was empty. So there are ways of handling those issues. And the English-speaking countries made much less effort to change public opinion. This took place much later, already at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, but not enough. Next slide, please. Outcomes. In terms of learning disabilities, what we know from more updated studies in 2019, most people with intellectual disability who left the institutions led a better quality of life in the community than they did in the hospital. And this included developing adaptive skills and receiving better care. Negative effects were there was more criminal behavior of those people living in the community versus their behavior in the hospital, which is hardly surprising given that they were totally segregated before. And if they engage in any criminal activity, it wasn't noticed and it was put down to their disability. But once you live in the community, it's different. They were also victimized by the local community, not by everyone, but by different layers of the community. And they were stigmatized, and they didn't have good enough skills to respond. And quite often they didn't have good enough social sanctions either. In terms of physical health, it's difficult to know whether what we saw when they left aging effects of living longer or lack of attention to their physical health, either in the institution or in the community. But it's quite well known that in primary care, there's less attention to physical complaint by people with either mental ill health or learning disabilities, as though they're not taken seriously. And this does need attention. The outcome studies show, however, that the quality of life for those with severe learning disability deteriorated if they lived in small group homes in the community. One possible explanation for that is that they became, to an extent, even more segregated because they already felt what it was like to be segregated in the community, given the victimization and given the way that they were valued in the community. It could also be that the living conditions were so different that maybe it was too late for some of them to leave the institution. Next slide, please. Outcomes in terms of mental illness, for the majority of people experiencing mental health issues who have gone through the digitalization and live now in the community, in most countries, this was a positive experience, and formally most countries embrace the recovery perspective, which doesn't mean necessarily that they practiced the principles of recovery. But what we have seen is that even people experiencing psychosis are less likely to end up in an institution than they were in the 20th century. So some of them will end up in re-institutionalized settings that I will talk about in a minute. The stigma attached to mental illness has been reduced considerably, though it has not disappeared. In one of the slides later, I'm explaining that the involvement of celebrities, people, who are celebrities, who are ready to come and say, I suffered from mental illness, I suffered from depression, I wanted to commit suicide, or I tried to commit suicide. It had made a huge difference. Likewise, some of the media has been publishing positive stories, and that made a difference as well. But we see that most of the change has been in the general public rather than among the professionals working with mentally ill people. And that is something we need to try and understand. Why would it be the professionals who are less ready to reduce their negative attitudes? Next slide, please. I want to look at the revolutionary aspect of the recovery approach. I'm quoting Jan Walcraft, who was one of the first service users to be a very active public figure in the UK. She was heading a commission in the National Institute of Mental Health, the UK National Institute, on involving service users in mental health services. And Jan wrote in 2005 that recovery is a concept whose philosophical boundaries and practice implication are still contested. I think this is the case now as well in 2021. Because although it is a main concept with which we describe alternative to the view that led to the total institution, we are not very clear what we mean by recovery. The definition is leading a more meaningful life, even though people may continue to have some symptoms. Or a better definition, which I like, by Larry Davidson, is the one of living with the illness and beyond the illness, because it does show also the aims that can be achieved in the future. And I'm suggesting that the most successful example of the recovery approach is perhaps embodied in the existence of peer support workers, who are people with lived experience of mental ill health and who are able to support other people in the mental health system and are paid for their work. Usually they work only part-time, and they may be part-time patients in another system, in another trust. But this group is more and more recognized as having a very positive contribution to make to the whole system. And the readiness to accept that the living experience of their living experience is the main source of their knowledge and the skills, so they do get some training, is really a sea change in the way we look at what people with mental illness bring with them. In the area of learning disabilities, we have some people who, for example, they in the UK, in social work and nursing, it is obligatory to involve service users from a variety of disabilities in training social work students. So we have some people with learning disabilities who, with a facilitator, do contribute. Also in the UK, any research application for public money has to be approved by a panel of people with lived experience of disabilities. It's called Public and Patient, PPI. And some of those people, again, are people with learning disabilities, quite often also with mental ill health. And of course, some people with physical ill health. Next, please. I'm not sure how much time I have. I have no time according to my time, but I still want to talk a little bit about the stigma studies. And to say that the stigma needs to be recognized. It does exist in everyday life, and mass media studies are the best way to get the sense of how the media treats those people. And you won't be surprised to see that there is a range. The more right-wing a newspaper or a television station is, the less the more stigmatizing it is. And the more left of center it is, the less it stigmatizes. But there is also internalized stigma that a lot of people with any disability internalize the view of the outsiders, that they are people with whom something is wrong. We have just finished the Paralympic, which has been, it's a fantastic exercise in stigma reduction, because it does show how people with a variety of disabilities, some very serious physical disabilities, are not only able to exercise in different sport activities, but to excel in those activities. I mentioned already the providers, and some of the explanation why the provider stigma is less reduced than the general public, I think has to do with the fact that they work with the more extreme edge, if you want, the people with higher level of disability, and they see less success. But they also see success. So this is only a partial explanation. Next slide, please. Reinstitutionalization. This is measured by the reintroduction of features of the total institution into mental health services. I don't have evidence of learning disabilities in this context, but there is plenty of evidence in mental health services. And this often takes place in residential facilities, where people, in a sense, are living only with other people with the same disability. And their choices of doing things inside and outside of the residential facility are restricted and regimented. It also happens in learning disabilities and with people experiencing dementia. And it's partly said, it's the same argument that we had with total institution, that they need to be segregated for their own good, for which there's really no evidence. To the contrary, we have evidence that the more contact they have with the local community, the chances that they will develop a lower level of disability and they will need less intervention, and they can develop more local activities, the better for everyone. So we see it also, especially in people who live in secure settings. For example, people who either committed small offenses, but also have mental illness and therefore are judged as in need of a special secure setting, which, by the way, are very expensive financially, but and they seem to be more responding to the fear of the public, or maybe the fear of the professionals as well. Sorry. Yes, I mean, we see it also in many countries that people who live in group homes are not sufficiently encouraged to do things in the community, and we are not working with the community to enable those options. I'm mentioning here a Slovenian study. Next slide, please. So the current situation, according to that study from 2020 by Siska and Biddle-Brown for the European Commission, there's 1.5 million people living in institutions for learning disabilities and mental illness in the 27 EU countries. With the exception of Sweden, all other countries have institutional settings. It's really useful to go and visit Sweden to see how they manage without. But it's also telling that it's the only country in Europe without. We think that this number is an underestimate because migrants are not included, and migrant children are not included at all. A quarter of this population are people with intellectual disabilities, and a smaller but considerable percentage are people with mental illness. So it still means that people with physical illness are also staying in institutional settings. And only 7 of the 27 countries, we have seen a reduction in the number of institutional people in comparison to 2010. So we have seen considerable reduction in numbers between the 1990s to 2010. And now we are seeing less than we saw then. Next slide, please. The reason for that, I think some of it has got to do with the austerity wave of 2008, where there has been a reduction in public spending, including in health and social care, especially in housing, and much more in social care than in health in most countries. And I think, but it is also a reflection of an insufficient lack of commitment to the deinstitutionalization policy. It's lack of readiness to invest in population group perceived as economically unproductive, and hence within a neoliberal ideology not worthy of further investment in them. I think this is a major issue that we usually don't talk about. What is the impact of the neoliberal ideology which rules our economic life in many countries on digitalization? And of course, it shows that the commitment to digitalization may be only skin deep, that not enough people believe really in it, even when it is a formal ideology. And despite the phenomenal level of evidence that we have that people with disabilities have the ability, most of them, to lead a meaningful life with support. Yes, they do need support, but it doesn't mean they can't lead a meaningful life outside of an institutional setting. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. Sorry, in the one that I just, okay, can we go back to that slide? Yeah. I just want to mention also that the sustainability of the digitalization is clearly linked to the investment and the creation of community mental health services. And it is reinforced by enabling people a higher degree of self-responsibility and choice by those people, like with direct payment, individualized budgets, decision about discharge, which I prefer to call about transition rather than discharge, which is about leaving prison. Maybe this is how it feels. But these are some of the measures we have got. And I could continue to talk about it because quite a lot of it is very relevant to the development of shared decision-making, which I'm not going to talk about, but which is the main area that I'm working on. Next slide, please. I want to remind us of the differential continued compulsory admission and community treatment orders. In most countries, there is still the legal possibility of taking people with either learning disabilities or mental ill health into compulsory admission against their will. The only other group that we allow it with are people with infected diseases. And this, of course, relates to the COVID that I hope to come to. And in many countries, there are also similar treatment orders in the community where people have to go to live in a particular named place and have to present themselves to get treatment in mental health services. What we find in a country like UK is, and there is an increase now in people who go through compulsory admission across Europe, not just in a particular country. But in the UK in particular, we find that people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic, which is BAME, compulsory admission rate is 4.5 times more than that of white people. We find that in relation to community treatment orders, it is 6 times more for this particular group than it is for white people. And these are statistics of the Office of National Statistics of the UK from the latest one that we have got, which is 2019-2020. And we did know about those facts for a long time. We also know that they are much less referred to psychological intervention, to psychotherapy. It may have to do that they present themselves later to psychiatric services, so they present themselves at a higher level of difficulty. This is because they don't trust the white professionals. And studies that worked on that issue of their experience, including a very recent one of my PhD students, looking at the experience of first admission to a psychiatric hospital by Black people, shows that there are a number of areas where they feel that they are treated much worse than white people, from the nature, the type of food to the way they are approached. So although we knew all of that for a long time, it's really more recently due to the Black Lives Matter movement that there's a bit more attention to this particular issue. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm just going to, yes, I know that I need to finish. Sorry, where am I? Hello?
Yeah, sorry, Shula, we were...
Yeah, here I am.
Yeah, but,
yeah. I want just to mention the issue of risk avoidance and of risk-taking. Most professional providers are trained just to pay attention to risk avoidance, to the possibility of harm to oneself or harm to others. And there's very little attention to the fact that in most of our day-to-day life, private life, including of those same professionals, we take risks all the time. We take risk in every transition point in our life. And my best example that I'm not going to go much into is falling in love. You know, we choose partners for life, where this is a phenomenal risk-taking activity. given how little we actually know about the person we choose in most cases. But this need to calculate risk and to encourage people to take risks, because if you want people to take responsibilities for their life, and many of them are able to do it more and more, you need to give them the option of taking risk. And this is something we are not training our professionals to do, because we are afraid of what will happen to us as professionals in any case where risk was not avoided. Next slide, please. The next one, next, please. I haven't got time for that one. I just want to remind all of you, so I'm sure you are aware of it, there's been phenomenal development of service users and a bit less of carers' perspective. Judy Chamberlain book On Our Own was published first, this is a mistake, in 1979, not 1997. And she actually developed in the United States the user movement, not on her own, of course. Survivors Speak Out followed in the UK, and the Italian Psychiatric Democratica developed the international réseau, which was also about service user networks. This particular way of really putting the living experience at the center and giving much more power, literally power, within the decisions about one's life is very, very important. Carers get much less attention, despite the fact that they really have quite a lot of work to do when a family member has a serious mental illness. And quite often they become a powerful group in some countries, and they often support more institutional settings because they feel that they are not supported enough. So they are afraid to an extent of the person coming back or the person staying in the community without a strong institutional framework. And we need to take that into account. Next, please. There's quite a lot of narratives that I've mentioned some before. There's also this particular book published after 35 years of the Italian experience. There are quite a number of such books. Next slide, please. And they're very important, including the very recent article published by Mojca Jurok from Slovenia just last month about the right to have say in digitalization of mental illness in Slovenia. And I would like to say that I was with Mojca, Vito, and many experts in experience at the historical march from the north to the center through key psychiatric hospitals in 2010. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk now about family-focused intervention, not because they are not important, but we haven't got the time. Next. I want to say something about the deinstitutionalization and the pandemic. In most countries, we have care homes, which are mainly for people with long-term physical ill health, who suffered considerable lack of attention during the COVID, and became literally a death trap for residents and for staff members. In the UK, people were sent to hospitals when they were in a very late stage of the infection from care homes, and they were sent back from the care homes to the care homes from general hospitals while still ill, and they did infect other people. And the way this was responded to was by segregating the care homes. So each of our countries does have a growing number of older people who live longer and who will, and therefore we will continue to have care homes unless we provide the necessary support at home, in the place where people lived before this type of institutionalized care. It doesn't mean that every care home is a bad place, but it does mean that it's much more segregated, and it is bound to be institutionalized. I'm involved, this is a totally different population. I'm going to talk on Thursday on the work with social workers and asylum seekers in North Greece and South Italy. But this is not just about those two places. In most countries, mental health service staff members move to work via the phone on the internet, justified by the possibility of infection to themselves and hence also to their families. And those modes of intervention do not suit everyone. So some people find them useful. And if you invest in how you build a talk on the internet or on the phone, you can achieve more. But many day programs and social activities were stopped for people with mental illness, for people with learning difficulties, for asylum seekers. And people became much more isolated, much more lonely than they were before. And also they were neglected by the health service, even if they didn't have the COVID, or more correctly, if they did not have it, they were more likely to be neglected. And therefore, the waiting time for any intervention that they needed is much, much longer. And we are seeing the results of that now. There's a report by Martin Knapp from this year that shows, that everyone with a disability, any disability, is suffering as a result of that. So I don't have to tell you that in the relation to both people with learning disabilities and mental ill health, isolation and loneliness only exacerbate the impact of any other problems that they have. So I can't even mention even one positive outcome of the COVID, I'm sorry to say. Even though I know that quite a number of communities actually did try to reach people who couldn't come physically to collect food and things like that. Next slide, please. The very last one. The lesson for the future. Deinstitutionalization represents a radical departure from the past of policies and practices for these two groups. And a number of influential groups were bound to oppose to it, either overtly or covertly, such as right-wing politicians and professionals who stood to lose their power bases due to deinstitutionalization. Hence, if we wish it to remain a core policy, we need to focus on attitudinal change. We still have to do that work or redo it, especially with our politicians and our psychiatrists. We need to engage people who use health and social care services as partners to any decision we take about their lives. This really needs to be a priority if we want them to become more of the citizens they can be, and also need less the specialist services. We should pay much more attention to carers and their involvement in this process, not just to the informal carers, but also the professionals. Thank you very much for listening for so long, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you. Bye.